My name is Thomas Blackwood, and I am 42 years old, and I have spent the last 30 years keeping a secret that has eaten away at me with the consistency of rust on old iron. The secret is this. I was not raised by my parents. I was raised by something that most people would call a dogman or a creature, though that word feels cheap and flattened, like trying to describe the ocean with a teaspoon. I know how that reads. I know what the rational response is. Before we dive in, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel for more untold stories like this one. Turn on notifications so you don't miss a single episode. And if you find this story compelling, leave a like and a comment below. Now, let me tell you what really happened. I've heard it from therapists, from friends, from my ex-wife before she took the settlement and got the hell away from me. The standard interpretation is that I was raised by humans, and my mind has rewritten the narrative as a coping mechanism. That I've confused metaphor with memory, that I'm describing an abusive father in animal terms because it's easier than facing what actually happened to me. I stopped trying to convince people a long time ago. This is not a story I'm telling because I need validation. I'm telling it because the non-disclosure agreement expired on my 35th birthday, and that was 7 years ago. And I have been living in the borrowed time of a secret that was never supposed to come out. I'll start with the night I was taken. I was 4 years old. I lived in a suburb of Boise, Idaho with my biological parents, Richard and Catherine Blackwood. My father worked for a mining equipment supplier. My mother did data entry at an insurance company. We had a yellow lab named Copper. I had a best friend named Marcus who lived 2 houses down. I had a normal childhood, right up until the night I didn't. October 19th, 1986. I remember the date because my mother was planning my 5th birthday party for 2 weeks later. And I'd been looking at the Toys R Us catalog obsessively. I wanted an Optimus Prime Transformer. I remember the red and blue box. I remember my mother saying we'd see what Santa could do. I remember my father laughing and saying, I'd be lucky if I got a Happy Meal toy. I remember the sound of that laugh. I remember all of it in the way you remember anything that splits your life into before and after. That night, I woke up to a sound that didn't belong in a quiet suburban neighborhood. A sound like wind through a canyon, except we lived on flat ground with no canyons within 300 miles. I got out of bed and walked to my window and pushed back the Spider-Man curtains. There was something standing in our front yard. In the streetlight, it looked like a man standing on his hind legs, 7 feet tall, covered in dark coarse fur. The proportions were wrong. The limbs were too long, the shoulders too broad, the head too large and too angular. It stood perfectly still, just watching the house. I didn't feel fear. I was 4. I didn't have the framework for fear yet. I had curiosity. I remember thinking it looked sad. That was the word I used in my head. Sad. Like it was waiting for someone who wasn't coming. I heard my parents stirring. My father shouted something. The thing in the yard turned its head and looked toward the sound. Then it looked back at my window. At me. It raised one massive arm and made a gesture. Come. That was the only word that fit what it was saying. Come. I got dressed. I took my shoes and my stuffed rabbit because I couldn't imagine being without my stuffed rabbit. I climbed out the window onto the roof and then down the oak tree we used for climbing. I walked across the lawn to this impossible thing and it didn't move. It just watched me. When I got close, I reached out and took what I thought was its hand. The fur was coarse and warm. The hand itself was huge, with fingers that were too long and nails that were curved and thick as nickels. It led me into the woods behind the neighborhood. Behind us, I could hear my father shouting. I could hear my mother crying. I could hear sirens already starting up in the distance. But the thing didn't hurry. It walked with a steady, patient stride, and I had to run a little to keep up, my shoes making soft sounds on the pine needles. We walked deeper into the forest than I had ever been. The trees got closer together. The ground got softer. The air started to smell different, like pine and wet earth, and something underneath it that I couldn't name. After a long time, we came to a place where the forest opened into a small clearing, and there were others. 3 more of them, smaller than the one who had taken my hand, but still massive. They surrounded me and examined me the way veterinarians examine animals. Their breath was hot and smelled of meat. Their eyes were intelligent and filled with something I would later understand as sorrow. The largest of them, the one I would come to think of as the patriarch, knelt down until his face was level with mine. He had yellow eyes and a long snout and teeth that filled his entire mouth. He should have terrified me. Instead, he did something unexpected. He wept. Actual tears ran down the coarse fur of his face and dripped onto the forest floor. He reached out and touched my forehead with one massive finger, and I felt something pass through me, a knowledge, a weight, a responsibility that no 4-year-old should ever have to carry. Then he lifted me and carried me deeper into the forest, and the sounds of sirens faded away. And that was the last I ever saw of Boise, Idaho. The settlement was built into the side of a mountain in central Wyoming. It was not a hidden place in the sense that it was invisible. It was hidden in the sense that it simply did not exist in any official capacity. No maps, no records, no trails that would lead you there unless you already knew where it was. The dwellings were built from stone and timber and blended so completely with the natural landscape that you could walk past them and think you were looking at a collapsed cliff face or a cave system. The people, and I use that word carefully because they were and were not people, lived in a way that was neither fully civilized nor fully wild. They hunted, they built shelter, they raised young, they passed knowledge to the next generation through speech and through something more direct that I never fully understood. Transference, a way of putting information into another's mind without speaking. The patriarch was called Thorn. He had scars that covered his entire body in a pattern that suggested great age and great violence survived. There were claw marks that ran parallel down his left side, as if something massive had tried to disembowel him long ago. There were burn marks on his shoulders. There was a deep gouge running along his right foreleg that suggested a near miss from a blade. He was the oldest of them that I knew of, though he would never tell me how old. When I asked, he would tap me on the chest over my heart and say, "Only the years that matter are the ones you earn." What he meant, I would eventually understand, was that aging wasn't just about the passage of time. It was about what you learned in that time, how many hunts you survived, how many seasons you endured, how many young you raised and protected, how many mistakes you made and recovered from, how many instances of loss and grief you carried without breaking. Thorn's age was measured not in years, but in depth of understanding. He knew things about the forest and about survival and about the nature of consciousness that came from centuries of observation. He moved through the settlement with a presence that was almost ceremonial. Other beings would defer to him. They would wait for his decisions before acting on important matters. But he wasn't tyrannical about his power. He led through consensus as much as authority. When disputes arose, he would listen to both sides patiently and then make a judgment that somehow seemed to satisfy everyone. I remember asking him once how he managed that. He said that most disputes came from both sides being partially right. His job wasn't to choose which side was right, but to find the path forward that honored the validity in both positions while protecting the settlement as a whole. The others had names too. The matriarch, Alara, who had a gray muzzle and eyes the color of amber and a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to her size. Then there was Kor, a young male perhaps in his 20s in human equivalent terms, who took it upon himself to educate me. And there were others. I learned over time that the settlement held maybe 40 beings in total, spread across different caves and clearings connected by paths that only they could navigate. They fed me, they clothed me, they built me a small dwelling of my own, which I shared with Kor, and they began the process of turning me into something that could survive in their world. The first month was agony. My body wasn't built for the cold. My feet blistered and bled. My skin was too soft. I got infections from simple cuts that nearly killed me. Ilara would treat my wounds with poultices made from plants I didn't recognize. She would crush the leaves between her massive hands, mix them with rendered fat and warm water, and apply them to my injuries with a gentleness that contradicted her size entirely. The poultices smelled of earth and something slightly bitter. The cuts would close. The infections would fade. But the real education wasn't physical. It was psychological. They taught me to think the way they thought. One day, about 6 months into my time there, Thorn took me to a cliff edge overlooking a vast valley. We stood there in the pre-dawn darkness, and he didn't say anything. We just waited. As the sun began to rise, I heard sounds I'd never heard before. Wolves, but not in the way I'd heard them described. This was a conversation. Kor had taught me a little of their language by then, enough to understand fragments. The wolves were discussing something about elk migration patterns, about a young calf separated from its herd, about the best route down the mountain without encountering human settlements. I realized in that moment that I had been thinking of consciousness incorrectly. Intelligence wasn't something that required words or writing or cities. It was the ability to understand complexity, to make plans, to understand consequences. And these beings possessed all of that and more. They could survive in a world that wanted nothing more than their extinction, which required a kind of strategic thinking that most humans would never develop. Not like a human child surrounded by other humans learning human ways, but like a prey animal learning to recognize the subtle shifts in air pressure that indicated a predator nearby. Like a nocturnal being learning to interpret the forest through sound instead of sight. They showed me that consciousness wasn't singular. It wasn't just one way of being aware and intelligent. There were different types of intelligence. The intelligence of a wolf pack hunting in formation. The intelligence of a tree learning to grow around obstacles. The intelligence of a river finding its path down a mountain. They possessed a kind of distributed awareness that humans never developed because humans had language and written systems and didn't need to rely on the kind of constant sensory vigilance that the beings maintained. They taught me to read the forest. Every tree leaning, every animal trail, every shift in the wind told a story. Kor would take me out and we would sit for hours in silence, and he would transmit knowledge into my mind. Not words, images, sensations. The feeling of predator and prey, the bone-deep understanding that I was neither, that I occupied a strange space between. They taught me their language, which was part vocal, part physical, growls and barks that meant things, combined with body language that conveyed nuance that human speech couldn't touch. It took months to learn because it wasn't a language that could be learned the way humans learn language. There was no vocabulary list, no grammar to memorize. Instead, it was immersion. Kor and I would sit for hours, and he would vocalize in different tones, and I would try to recreate the sounds. Some of them came naturally. Others required me to use parts of my throat that hadn't been exercised before. My transformation was facilitating the physical ability to produce these sounds. As my canines grew in and my jaw extended slightly, I could create sounds that younger human me could never have created. The language was precise. A single sound could convey information that would take 10 words to express in English. A rising growl could mean a question. A flat growl could mean certainty. A descending growl could mean closure or finality. Combinations of sounds created new meanings. It was like learning a tonal language, but with additional layers of meaning encoded into the resonance and frequency of the sound itself. And underneath it all was the transference. The ability to just put ideas directly into another mind without words at all. I never fully learned to initiate it. My human brain didn't have the neurological architecture for it, but I learned to receive it. When Kor wanted to teach me something complex, he would approach me and press his forehead against mine, and suddenly I would just know. I would understand things that I had no context for. The feeling of hunting prey, the taste of raw meat, the way a forest smells when you've been tracking something for hours. It was overwhelming at first. It felt like being invaded. But I learned to open myself to it, and it became the most profound form of communication I've ever experienced. They taught me their history, or at least they tried. The information came in fragments, in images that didn't quite translate to human concepts. I understood that they were ancient, that they had been in North America before humans arrived, that they had watched civilization spread and had adapted by hiding, that there had been covenants, agreements with certain humans, pacts written in blood that bound both sides to silence. Thorne showed me one of the documents once. It was nearly 300 years old, written in a script I couldn't read, sealed with wax and signatures that looked almost like hoof prints. The parchment was yellowed and fragile. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the work of someone trained in formal documentation. He said it was a treaty. Boundaries drawn, territory established, consequences agreed upon if either side violated the terms. It outlined specific regions where they would maintain their presence, specific human settlements that would remain unmolested, specific hunting grounds where they could feed without interference. In exchange, they would not reveal themselves, would not kill humans except in defense, would remain hidden from the expanding human civilization. He never told me which side had violated the terms most often, but I understood from the bitterness in his voice that the answer was human. The Book of Enoch was something I discovered on my own. In the 3rd month of my captivity, I found a book hidden in Alara's cave. It was a printed edition, worn and marked up with notes in a handwriting that looked almost human but had too many sharp angles. Enoch. The book was about angels, the Watchers, beings that had come down from heaven and had taken human wives and produced offspring that were tall and strong and terrifying, the Nephilim. Enoch described them in detail, their size, their intelligence, their hunger. I read it in secret because I knew I wasn't supposed to have it. When Thorn found me reading, he didn't punish me. He sat down beside me and took the book gently and looked at the cover for a long time. Then he said something that I've been turning over in my head for nearly 40 years. He said, "We are not Nephilim. We are something older. And we are still here because humans forgot to believe we exist." The longer I stayed, the more I understood the structure of their society. They had hierarchies, they had leaders. Their legal system was something I never fully grasped, but I understood enough to know it was real. When a dispute arose between two beings over hunting territory, it wasn't settled with violence. Thorn would listen to both sides. He would ask questions that seemed simple, but carried weight. He would sometimes ask each side to state what they thought the other side's legitimate concerns were. Often, just articulating the other perspective would lead to resolution. It taught me something crucial about conflict that I would later apply to my own struggles with humans. Most people are not actually opposed on fundamental truths. They're opposed because they haven't adequately understood the other's underlying needs. I watched Thorn facilitate a dispute about water access during a particularly dry season. By the end, the two beings had agreed to a shared schedule that protected both of their family units. Thorn didn't impose this solution. He guided them to discover it themselves. They had rules. They had morality, though it operated on a different wavelength than human morality. They killed. They hunted. They consumed flesh. But they also cared for their young. They protected their weak. They made decisions collectively. They had mourning rituals when one of them died. They were not monsters in any simple sense. They were apex predators that had evolved consciousness and had learned to hide that consciousness behind the mask of animal behavior. But the most important thing they taught me was fear, not fear of them. Fear of the outside world. They showed me what humans did when they found evidence of something that didn't fit their categories. Thorn took me to a place where the bones of one of their own lay bleached in the sun. This was Joshua. Thorn said his name with a growl that held grief. Joshua had ventured too close to human settlement. Humans had seen him, had hunted him, had killed him. His bones bore marks, deep slashes from high-powered rifles, crushed sections where humans had smashed him with heavy objects. They had tried to destroy the body completely, but had failed. Thorn had come and carried Joshua back to this place and had chosen to show me what happened when their world collided with human world and humans got a good look. "This is why we hide," Thorn said. "Not because we are afraid, because humans are afraid and their fear makes them kill." I remember asking Thorn once why they didn't fight back, why they didn't defend themselves more aggressively against the humans who hunted them. He sat with that question for a long time before answering. He said fighting back would require exposure. It would require coming out of hiding in force. And humans, he said, have something we don't have. They have organization at scale. They have the ability to communicate across vast distances and coordinate millions of individuals toward a single goal. We have never had that capacity. Our strength is small group cohesion, intimate knowledge of territory, patience across generations. A war with humans would be one we could never win. But coexistence, carefully managed, quietly maintained, was sustainable. It required sacrifice. It required watching humans encroach on our territories. It required seeing some of our own hunted and killed. But it was survival. And survival, he said, sometimes looks like acceptance of injustice. It's a harsh philosophy, but it keeps us alive. For 5 years I lived in that settlement. I grew from a child of 4 into a child of 9. My body changed. I became stronger. I became faster. My senses sharpened. I could smell the presence of a deer from 200 yards away. I could hear a heartbeat from 50 feet. My teeth began to shift. The canines elongated. My nails thickened and curved. My body began to move differently. I began to hunch slightly, though not dramatically. The progression was gradual, not painful, but uncomfortable. Like my skin didn't quite fit right anymore. Like my joints were learning new ways to bend. The beings didn't mark the changes with ceremony, but they acknowledged them. When my teeth shifted, Ilara brought me soft foods and showed me how to clean between the new fangs with water and ash. When my nails changed, Cora taught me how to care for them so they wouldn't become brittle. When my body's flexibility increased, the older beings began training me in movement in ways they hadn't before. Cora told me during a transference session that I was beginning my first transformation, that my genetics were beginning to express something that had been dormant in the Blackwood line, that some ancestor far back had crossed the line between human and being in ways that human records had forgotten, that I carried both bloodlines and they were finally finding equilibrium, that I was becoming something neither fully human nor fully dogman, but a bridge between the two. I was horrified. I was also exhilarated. I didn't fully understand what was happening to me, but it felt right in a way that human childhood had never felt right. It felt like coming into myself, like every moment of my human childhood had been a costume that was finally being shed. And then the raid happened. I don't know how they found us. To this day, I don't know if someone talked, or if someone followed a trail, or if someone just got lucky and stumbled onto the settlement. But on a day in May when I was 9 years old and Thorn and most of the hunters were away, humans came. Soldiers. They came up the mountain with rifles and equipment, and they knew exactly what they were looking for. They knew the layout of the settlement. They knew where the young would be. They knew the weak points in our defense. Ilara tried to fight them. I remember the sound, the cracking of her bones when the bullets hit her, the way she screamed a sound that was rage and pain and protective fury all at once. I remember being grabbed by Cor and carried deep into the mountain through passages I'd never seen before. I remember the sound of more gunfire echoing through the stone. I remember Cor pressing me into a cave and telling me to stay and running back toward the sounds. I remember waiting in the dark for a very long time. I remember the sounds stopping. I remember silence so complete that I thought I had gone deaf. I stayed in that cave for 3 days. I didn't cry. I didn't call for help. I sat in the dark and I waited. My small body was curled against the cold stone. My stuffed rabbit was clutched against my chest. The sounds of battle had faded hours ago, but they echoed in my memory. The gunfire, the screams, the sounds of the beings fighting to protect us. I tried to understand what had happened. Ilara had said to run. Cora had carried me to the cave and told me not to move. Don't leave, don't make sound, don't let them hear you. I had obeyed. I had sat in the dark, and I had waited. On the 4th day, a man found me. He was dressed in tactical gear and carried a pistol, and his name was Captain Kenneth Prescott. I knew his name because it was written on a tape on his chest. He pointed the weapon at me and asked who I was, and I told him my name, and he lowered the weapon slightly and said something into a radio about a hybrid asset. His voice was calm, but his hands were shaking. He approached me slowly. The way you approach a wild animal you're trying not to spook. He told me my name was Thomas, and that my family had been looking for me and that everything was going to be okay. I didn't believe him. Something in his posture, the way his pupils were dilated, the faint smell of adrenaline that clung to his skin, all of it told me that nothing was okay, and nothing would be okay ever again. They took me to a facility that I later understood was in Nevada, a government black site, underground, shielded. The kind of place that doesn't exist except in rumors and conspiracy theories and the nightmares of people who stumble too close to the truth. My childhood ended that day in the mountain. My education in the being world ended. My education in the human world began. The isolation chambers were worse than any physical torture could have been. You see, when you grow up in the forest with constant sensory input, constant awareness, constant connection to the world around you, being placed in absolute white silence is a form of psychological devastation. The first time they put me in one, I lasted 4 hours before I started screaming. The sound didn't echo the way I expected. The whiteness seemed to absorb it. After a few days, I stopped screaming. I sat in the corner and I tried to track my own heartbeat, use the rhythm of my breathing to keep some connection to the fact that I was still alive, still real. They measured everything. They measured how my body chemistry changed without stimulation. They measured how my enhanced senses, the ones the settlement had nurtured, began to deteriorate without input. It was like watching a language you'd spent years learning slowly evaporate from your mind. The researchers would note this with fascination. Dr. Sutton watched my decline with something that looked like genuine concern, and I hated him for that, almost more than I hated the ones who were deliberately trying to break me. Concern implied acknowledgement of my humanity, and if they acknowledged my humanity, then what they were doing to me was a choice, not a necessity. The facility was called Pinnacle. That was the designation on the metal doors and the official correspondence. The people who ran it were scientists, geneticists, neurologists, researchers of the sort that operate when oversight is minimal and ethics are negotiable. They wanted to understand what I was. They ran tests, they took samples, they scanned my brain, they mapped my genetic code, they put me in isolation chambers and watched me through one-way glass. The chambers were white, completely white, no variation, no stimulation, just white walls and white floor and white ceiling and time passing. A lot of time, hours, sometimes days. They told me it was to observe my behavior in absence of stimulus. What they were actually doing was breaking me down, making me desperate enough to cooperate. They showed me videos of other beings, some of them captured, some of them wild footage shot from a distance, and measured my physiological responses with monitors they had attached to my chest and temples. They were fascinated and horrified in equal measure by what they found. My DNA was showing markers that shouldn't exist, sequences that didn't match any known primate, indications of very old genetic material combined with very recent human genetic material, suggesting centuries of careful breeding. Cross-pollination at some point, intentional hybridization. They didn't know my history. They assumed I was the result of a long-term breeding program between beings and captured human subjects. They showed me genetic charts. They talked about my value as a research specimen. They discussed what therapeutic applications my unique biology might have. They talked about me as if I wasn't a person, as if I was a thing to be studied and dissected and understood. It took them months to get the truth out of me, and they got it only because one of the researchers, a man named Dr. Alan Sutton, treated me with something resembling humanity. He was older, maybe 60, with gray hair and kind eyes that didn't fit with the sterile halls of Pinnacle. He brought me books, real books, not screened materials, science fiction, adventure, stories about people escaping impossible situations. He asked me questions without scanning my brain first. He listened when I talked about Thorn and Alara and Core. He didn't interrupt, he didn't take notes, he just listened. And gradually, I told him everything about the settlement, about how old they were, about the covenants, about the Book of Enoch and Thorn's insistence that they were something older and more fundamental than any mythology suggested. I told him about my transformation, about the things I could do that weren't human, the way I could navigate in perfect darkness, the way my hearing had become acute enough to function as a weapon, the way I could smell the intent on someone's skin, could know if they were afraid or angry or sympathetic, just by breathing in their fierce sweat. Sutton recorded everything, and then he used it. He took what I had told him, and he compiled it into a briefing document for the higher-ups, and the higher-ups made a decision. They decided that I was an asset, not a prisoner, not exactly, an asset, a resource to be developed. They offered me a deal. I could cooperate with their research program. I could help them understand what they were and how they functioned and what their capabilities were and what their vulnerabilities were. In exchange, they would provide me with protection, with resources, with a life that wouldn't be spent in an isolation cell. I was 9 years old. I was alone. Everyone I had ever loved was either dead or imprisoned. I was becoming something that humans instinctively feared and hunted. I took the deal. I spent the next 15 years at Pinnacle, 15 years helping the United States government build a weapons program designed to locate and neutralize beings that the government had decided were a national security threat. Every piece of information I gave them felt like a betrayal. When I showed them how to interpret scent markers, I was teaching them how to track my people. When I explained the settlement's defensive positions, I was drawing them a map to the places where families slept. The weight of this accumulated day after day, year after year. Dr. Sutton seemed to understand this. He would ask me questions in a way that wasn't purely clinical. He would acknowledge the moral weight of what he was asking me to do. But acknowledgement without refusal to participate is just complicity dressed up in understanding. I was angry with him for understanding, because it meant he knew what he was doing was wrong and he did it anyway. And I was angry with myself for continuing to give him the information, for becoming complicit in the construction of a weapon that would be used against the beings who had raised me, saved me, loved me. I helped them understand their neurology. I attended lectures by neuroscientists who discussed my brain scans as if I wasn't in the room. I helped them develop sensory countermeasures. I allowed them to test ultrasonic frequencies that made my teeth ache for hours afterward. I helped them train soldiers how to fight something that could kill them easily if they made a mistake. I watched soldiers practice extraction techniques on me, while military intelligence officers took notes. I helped them build a database of their DNA so they could identify individuals across generations. I provided blood samples, hair samples, tissue samples. Every cell of my body became a data point. And with every piece of information I gave them, I died a little bit, because I knew what they were planning. They didn't tell me explicitly, but I could read between the lines of their research. They were planning a cull, a systematic elimination of the beings. Somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 individuals spread across North America, from Mexico to Canada. A genocide. The documents were clear, the estimates were precise, the methodologies were detailed, and they wanted to use me to make it work. They wanted me to help them because I was the perfect weapon. I was fast enough, strong enough, smart enough, and I was human enough that other humans would trust me. I would be the wolf in wolf's clothing, sent into the deep forests and the hidden settlements, and the places where they had built their society, and I would help identify targets for eradication. When I was 24, I refused. They brought me into a conference room with generals and intelligence officers, and they laid out the plan in detail, and they told me my role, and I said no. When they finally asked me to actively help them hunt down creatures, it was the moment I understood that I had been participating in my own moral dissolution. I had told myself that I was just answering questions, just being a subject of study. But there's a line between passive cooperation and active participation. They wanted me to go into the field with the operatives. They wanted me to use my senses to track beings, to identify vulnerable populations, to act as a guide to the places where families had established settlements. That's when I said no. It took me 15 years to say no. 15 years of telling myself that I had no choice. 15 years of slowly recognizing that I did have a choice. I was just too frightened to make it. But when they laid out the plan in that conference room, with generals discussing population estimates and eradication timelines in the same clinical tone they might use to discuss an insect infestation, something in me broke open. Not broke down. Broke open. A part of me that had been sealed shut to survive the unsurvivable suddenly demanded to be heard. They threatened me. They reminded me of my isolation. They reminded me that I was alive because they allowed it. They told me that if I didn't cooperate, they would turn me over to another research facility, a less hospitable one, somewhere the scientists didn't have any restrictions on what they could do to understand how I worked. I said no, again. I meant it. And then something unexpected happened. An investigator came to Pinnacle, a woman named Rachel Albright. She wasn't with the government, she was a journalist. She had somehow gotten intelligence about the facility, and about the beings, and about the existence of beings that weren't supposed to exist. She wanted to talk to me. The government wanted to prevent it. There was a standoff. Paperwork, lawyers, constitutional arguments. The government's position was that I was a classified asset and my testimony was privileged information. My position was that I wasn't actually a United States citizen. My parents were my biological parents, not my government handlers. I had rights. The courts agreed with me. Not all the courts, but enough of them. And when the government realized they were going to lose, they made another offer. They would let me go. In exchange, I would sign a non-disclosure agreement that would remain binding for 30 years. 30 years of silence about Pinnacle, about the beings, about the covenants, about everything. 30 years or federal prosecution and indefinite detention. I was 24. I did the math. I signed. Albright published her story anyway. Pieced together from other sources, other investigators, other leaks. The article named Pinnacle obliquely. It mentioned the existence of unclassified apex predators in North American wilderness. It suggested that there was evidence of a government research program designed to weaponize or eliminate unknown beings. It caused a stir for about 2 weeks. Then the government's communications people did their job. They called it a conspiracy theory. They pointed out the logical inconsistencies in Albright's sources. They suggested that she had been duped by people with axes to grind. They released official statements saying that the government would never conduct research into impossible beings because Impossible beings didn't exist. And the public accepted the official story because the official story was comfortable. The public believed what it wanted to believe. Albright quit journalism and moved to the Pacific Northwest and spent her time writing novels that nobody read. I got released. They gave me money, $150,000. Not a fortune, but enough to start over. They gave me a new identity. Thomas Blackwood was real, but the paper trail was thin. They filled in the gaps: birth certificate, social security number, employment history, references. They made me look like a normal person who had always existed in the normal world. And they watched me. For years, I could feel the surveillance. The way certain people would appear in my life and ask casually about my past. The way my phone would have strange clicks and pops that suggested tapping. The way I'd find evidence that people had been in my apartment while I was gone. It eventually stopped, or it became more subtle. I'm not sure which. And I learned to live. I tried to be human. I got a job managing a sporting goods store. I dated women who would eventually leave me when they sensed something wrong about me. Something not quite right. Something primal beneath the thin human veneer. I got married. I tried harder to be normal. It didn't work. I couldn't deny what I was. I couldn't suppress the transformations. In moments of stress, my teeth would shift. My nails would lengthen. My senses would flood into hyperdrive. My wife saw it happen once. She left, and she took with her half of everything, and a restraining order and a story she told to a therapist that ended up in someone's file somewhere as evidence of her ex-husband's psychological instability. And I waited. For 25 years I waited, and I kept the secret, and I felt it eating me from the inside out, and I counted the days until July 15th when the non-disclosure agreement would expire and I would be free to speak the truth as I understood it. On July the 15th of this year, I woke up and I knew I was free, and I started writing this. I started telling the story, and the moment I did, I felt something change. A weight lifted, a door opening, and I realized something else. The government had not lost interest in me. The government had never lost interest. They had simply been patient, waiting, and when I broke the silence, they had to act. 3 weeks ago, I got a visit. A man in a suit named Garrett who said he represented a private contractor that had acquired certain assets from a government program that had been officially discontinued. He showed me pictures of beings, wild population estimates, range maps, feeding territories, DNA samples, everything. He said the program hadn't been discontinued. It had been privatized. The government had funded and trained and armed a team of operatives, and that team now worked for a corporation that had secured contracts to eliminate the population across the western United States. They were using the data I had helped gather. They were using the infrastructure I had helped build. They were using information that I had provided under duress when I was young and broken and alone. He asked if I wanted to help stop them. He said there were others, other beings, other human allies, and that if I was willing to testify to what I knew, to provide documentation, to give them the details they needed, they could take action. And I said yes, which brings me here, to telling this story, to speaking the truth, to breaking the silence 30 years later and facing the consequences. Because there are beings in the deep forests of North America. There are beings that don't fit into human categories. There are dogmen and worse things, and they are still here, and they are still dying, because humans are afraid of what doesn't fit into their understanding of the world. And I was raised among them. I was taught by them. I was loved by them. And when the choice came to decide whose side I was on, I chose theirs. Thorne taught me that the deepest kind of power isn't the ability to dominate. It's the ability to choose not to. We could have defended our settlement more violently, but every single being there made the choice not to use their full strength, because they understood that restraint in the face of violence is a different kind of strength. It's harder to maintain than raw power. It requires living with the knowledge of what you're capable of while deliberately choosing limitation. This is something I carried with me through Pinnacle, through all the years of hiding, through the temptation to use what I had become against those who were trying to weaponize me. Thorne had taught me that the greatest victory isn't destroying your enemy. It's changing the world so thoroughly that enemies become unnecessary. What I'm about to tell you is the reason Garrett came to me. Because I don't just have knowledge, I have credentials, I have documentation. During my time at Pinnacle, I kept copies of everything. Not officially, not approved, but I kept copies because even then, Even as a traumatized child helping to build a weapon against my own kind, some part of me knew this day would come. I kept genetic sequencing data. I kept operational protocols. I kept the maps, the locations of known being territories, the routes the private military contractors were taking when they conducted their hunting operations, the names of the beings they had killed, hundreds of names, thousands of individual cases documented with the clinical precision of a genocide being measured. Garrett wanted the documents. I gave them to him. I also gave him something else. I gave him me. I told him I would work with them. I would be the interpreter between the human coalition and the beings. I would help coordinate a response that didn't involve warfare, that involved something more strategic, something that involved the government's deepest fear, which was transparency. We spent 3 months planning, 3 months of encrypted communications and coded meetings in coffee shops and dead drops in city parks like we were running some Cold War spy operation, which I suppose we were. They had resources, not money, not in the conventional sense, but influence. There were humans in government, in journalism, in intelligence agencies who had been sympathetic to the being's cause for decades. Some of them knew what they were protecting. Some of them just sensed that a line was being crossed, and that line shouldn't be crossed. We contacted them, we coordinated, we prepared. We were ready to go public with a package of documentation so comprehensive, so detailed, so utterly irrefutable that the government would have no choice but to acknowledge what it had been doing. And then we were going to burn everything down. The plan was to release everything simultaneously, in 5 countries, to journalists who had been vetted and briefed, to congressional offices that had shown interest in government overreach, to civil rights organizations, to universities and research institutions, a coordinated global blitz that would make it impossible for any single government to contain. Within hours of the release, the story would be all over the world. The cover would be blown. They would be acknowledged as real, and the eradication program would become a political catastrophe that no administration could survive. The private contractors would have to stand down. They would have no legal authority. They would be fugitives, and they would finally be free from the assumption of their own non-existence. It was ambitious. It was dangerous. It was the last chance any of us were going to get. We set a date, September 23rd, a Tuesday morning, 6 a.m. coordinated releases. I packed a bag. I said goodbye to the apartment I'd been renting. I quit the sporting goods store with no notice. I was done hiding. The night before the operation, I drove to a meeting point in the mountains east of Portland, a small town called Prairie City. Garrett and 3 other operatives met me at a cabin that belonged to one of their sympathizers. They looked scared, not frightened, something deeper. The kind of scared you feel when you're about to cross a line you can never uncross. Garrett showed me his phone, a list of contacts, journalists, investigators, government whistleblowers. The network was bigger than I had understood. Dozens of people, hundreds of pieces of information ready to go public simultaneously. All we needed was the final confirmation. One signal from me. I had the documents, Garrett had the distribution channels. Tomorrow morning, we would change the world. We talked through the night. The operatives told me stories about beings they had encountered. One woman named Petra had been hunting beings for the government until she realized what she was doing was wrong. She was 45 years old and had worked for the program for 9 years. She had a technical background in systems analysis and had been brought in to manage the equipment infrastructure, but she had become more than a desk operative. She had started going on field operations. She said she needed to understand what the equipment was being used for. She needed to see what they were hunting. She described the moment she understood. She was tracking a pair of juveniles through a forest in Montana. They were maybe 12 years old in human equivalent, fast, nervous, making the kinds of sounds that juveniles make, and she was set up to fire the moment they came into a clearing. But they didn't run. They led her not away, but toward her. They came out of the trees, and instead of attacking, they bowed. An actual bow, head lowered, arms spread, a gesture of supplication, a request for mercy. And she couldn't shoot them. She couldn't pull the trigger. She had lowered her weapon, and the juveniles had watched her for a long moment, and then they had turned and disappeared back into the forest. She went back to her commanding officer and said she was done. She was walking away. They had tried to recapture her. She had run. She had been living off the grid for 6 months, sleeping in cars and roadside motels, waiting for someone from the program to find her and neutralize her as a liability. A man named Thomas, not me but also Thomas, described being part of a team that participated in the killing of a family of beings, an adult pair and 3 juveniles. His job was to monitor vital signs as they died, to ensure the death was clean and quick. He had been a paramedic before the program. He had spent his life saving human lives. He said the juveniles died screaming in a way that sounded almost like language, like they were calling for their parents to come back. The adults died trying to shield them. The shots were precise and professional. The operation lasted 4 minutes. By the time it was over, there was nothing alive in the clearing. He had nightmares every night since. He had come forward because he couldn't live with it anymore, because his conscience had become too heavy, and because he had started to understand that he wasn't a healer, he was a facilitator of death, and that realization had broken something in him that couldn't be fixed. By dawn, we had everything prepared. The documents were encrypted and packaged. The release schedule was confirmed. The journalists were standing by. All that was left was to press send. Garrett looked at me and asked if I was sure. I said yes, I was sure. I had waited 40 years for this moment. I was sure. We had decided to release at 6 a.m. Eastern Time, which was 3 a.m. Pacific. That would give the morning shows and the news agencies on the East Coast time to process the information before any kind of government response could be organized. Garrett was going to handle the distribution. I was going to record a video testimony. I was going to explain who I was and what I had experienced and what the government had done. My face would go public. My story would be out there. There would be no way to walk it back. No way to deny it. No way to suppress it once it was loose in the world. I sat in front of a camera at 5 a.m. The cabin was quiet. The mountains outside were dark. Garrett had set up a professional rig, multiple angles, clean audio, the kind of production quality that would make it impossible to dismiss as amateur footage or doctored tape. And I started talking. I told the story of my abduction. I described the being standing in my suburban front yard. I described the feeling of its hand around mine. I described the fear and the strangeness, and the weird sense of coming home. I told the story of my childhood in the settlement. I described Thorn and Alara. I described the transference. I described the specific sensory experiences of learning to be something other than human. I told the story of the raid and my capture and my time at Pinnacle. I named the facility. I described the experiments. I described the isolation chambers. I described Dr. Sutton and the moment I realized that a human could treat me with kindness. I told the story of the agreement I had made and the 30 years of silence I had kept. I talked about the nightmares, the constant low-level fear, the way the secret had metastasized inside my chest like a cancer. I told the story of why I was breaking the silence now. I talked about the beings still being hunted, still being killed, still being denied their right to exist. I told the story of what I had learned about myself over 4 decades, that I was not fully human, that I was something in between, that I had gifts and curses that people would fear, that I had spent my life running from what I was because the world told me what I was should not exist, but that I was done running. I was done apologizing for what I was. I was done hiding. I was done letting fear dictate my choices. I talked for 45 minutes. I provided names, dates, locations, specific incidents. I described experiments in detail. I talked about other captured beings and what had happened to them. I described the genetic research and what the government had learned. I talked about the classified contracts with private military corporations. By the end, I was crying, and I didn't try to hide it. I didn't try to be composed and rational. I was broken and terrified, and I let it show. Because the truth wasn't composed. It was raw and damaged, and it needed to sound that way. And when the camera stopped rolling, Garrett stood up and said, "It was time." He pressed send. At 6 a.m. Eastern Time, the documents started hitting inboxes. The files started being published. The videos started being uploaded. The story went live. We sat in the cabin and watched it spread. News outlets started picking it up within minutes. They had been briefed in advance, so they knew what to do with the information. They knew which documents were authentic. They had already verified the data. Within an hour, the story was the top news story in the country. Within 2 hours, it was global. The hashtag started trending. The commentary started flowing. People couldn't believe it. People didn't want to believe it. But the documentation was too detailed, too professional, too official, too real. It was the kind of leak that came from inside the system, and it was clear that something had been hidden, something big. By midday, the government was in crisis mode. Official statements were being issued, denials, clarifications, half-hearted explanations about why certain research programs had been conducted under strict ethical guidelines. Nothing they said could compete with the sheer volume and specificity of the leaked files. The journalists who had been briefed were doing their jobs. They were cross-referencing. They were following the money trails. They were interviewing people who had been through the programs. They were authenticating the documents through independent channels. Each new verification made the government's denials look more desperate. By evening, Congress was calling for an emergency hearing. By the next day, the Attorney General announced a preliminary investigation. The phone lines in congressional offices were lighting up. The public was demanding answers. Social media was flooded with outrage. By the end of the week, 3 senior officials at the Pentagon had resigned. 2 of them claimed retirement. 1 cited family reasons. Nobody believed the explanations. The private military contractor that had been running the eradication program issued a statement saying they had been unaware of the true nature of the work they were conducting. They claimed they had been told they were managing a dangerous apex predator threat. They claimed they had followed all applicable laws. They claimed they would cooperate fully with any investigation. Nobody believed them. The documents were too clear. The intent was too obvious. The scale was too vast. No organization conducting legitimate wildlife management required the infrastructure that had been documented in the leaks. By the second week, the eradication program was officially shut down. Federal operatives began recovering captured beings. Holding facilities were raided. Research programs were terminated. The government was in damage control mode, and nothing was going to fix this. The story was too big, too real, too documented. And what I had expected would happen, what I had hoped would happen, began to happen. Investigative journalists started digging deeper. They started following the money. They started interviewing people. They started uncovering the true scope of what had been happening, not just the being issue, but the broader implications of it, a government program that had operated for decades outside of legal oversight, a military contractor that had been conducting operations in sovereign territories without proper authorization, a systematic program of elimination that would have been classified as genocide if the targets had been human. The story metastasized. It became not just about beings, but about government overreach and accountability and the kind of power that operates in the dark and the price of secrecy. It was exactly what we had hoped for. The beings began emerging, slowly at first, then more openly. There was a documented sighting in Yellowstone of a pack moving in daylight. Park rangers reported the incident. The footage showed 7 beings moving in formation through a meadow in the early morning light. They moved deliberately, without fear, as if they had decided that hiding was no longer necessary. There were reports from hikers in the Pacific Northwest of beings that didn't run away, but watched them pass with what observers described as curiosity. One hiker reported that a being had simply sat on a ridge overlooking the trail and watched him walk past. The hiker said that his immediate fear had been overcome by the realization that if the being wanted to harm him, it could have. The presence of choice, the possibility of peaceful coexistence. It fundamentally changed the hiker's understanding of the threat. There was a video posted on social media, unverified but compelling, of what appeared to be a being walking upright through a forest with something that looked like a gathered bag of supplies. Not hunting, not attacking, simply traveling, doing what beings do, but in a way that suggested intention and planning and a kind of human-like organization. The narrative shifted. Beings went from being monsters to being refugees, victims of a persecution campaign, beings that had been hiding for centuries only to be hunted by the government they had managed to coexist with. Scientific journals began publishing analysis of the leaked DNA. Anthropologists began examining the historical record for traces of being interactions with human cultures. Paleontologists began re-examining fossil records with new eyes. The body of knowledge shifted. The beings went from being cryptids to being recognized species. The public's fear was complicated by sympathy. And in that complication, the beings found space to exist. 2 months after the release, I got a letter. It didn't have a return address, but I knew where it came from. The handwriting was angular and sharp, written with something that wasn't quite a pen, the letters formed by something with claws. It was from Thorn. He wrote that he had received word of what I had done, that he had seen the video and understood what it had cost me. He wrote that the settlement had survived the raid, that many had been captured, but many had escaped, that they had rebuilt in a place deeper and more remote than before. He wrote that they had thought me lost forever when I was taken all those years ago, that they had grieved, but that some part of them had always wondered if I was still alive, and if I had not forgotten them. He wrote that now they knew I hadn't forgotten, that I had remembered them and had spoken for them when no one else could. He wrote that I was welcome to come home, that my place at their fires was waiting, that Alara had died since the raid, from injuries sustained while protecting the young, and that Kor had never stopped asking about me. He wrote that it was time, if I wanted to come back, if I wanted to stop hiding, if I wanted to embrace what I was instead of running from it. He wrote that the world was changing, that humans were beginning to acknowledge what they had refused to acknowledge before, that the time of total hiding might be ending, that they could begin to exist openly, carefully, but openly, and that I could be part of that, if I wanted to be. I read the letter in my car on a hillside overlooking a city, and I wept. For the first time in 40 years, I wept with relief instead of fear. I made the drive north. I went back to Wyoming. It took me 3 days. I parked my car at a trailhead that humans use regularly, and I walked into the wilderness, and I was found. Or I was allowed to be found. A young being, maybe 15 in human equivalent, approached me in a clearing and said my name, Thomas, and I recognized the cadence of it, the way it was spoken, the slight growl beneath the word. This was Kor's offspring. Kor had told them about me, had taught them my history, had made sure that when the day came that I was ready to come home, someone would be there to bring me the rest of the way. We walked together through the mountains. The sun was setting, and the forest was turning golden, and the air was cool, and it smelled like home in a way that no human place had ever smelled like home. We arrived at the settlement at night. The fires were lit, they were gathered, and Thorn was there, older, scarred, but with his eyes still the color of amber and his strength still undiminished. He had not moved from his position as patriarch. He had continued to lead, continue to guide, continue to carry the weight of responsibility for an entire species trying to survive in a world that denied their existence. When he saw me, something shifted in his posture. His massive frame seemed to collapse inward slightly, as if he had been holding himself rigid against some unbearable pressure, and now the pressure had been released. He approached me, and he knelt, which I had never seen him do, and he pressed his forehead against mine, and the connection was instantaneous. The transference, the sharing of knowledge and feeling and identity. And in that moment, I felt what he had felt for the past 40 years, the grief of believing me dead, the almost unbearable hope of discovering I was alive, the pride in what I had done, the knowledge that I had sacrificed myself for my people, the understanding that I had chosen to honor my heritage instead of running from it. And I understood that I was home, that the journey that had begun 40 years ago when that being stood in my suburban front yard had finally reached its destination, that everything I had done since I was 4 years old, the running, the hiding, the cooperating with the government, the accumulation of knowledge and documentation, it had all led to this moment, to coming back, to standing with my people when the world finally had to acknowledge that we were real. They asked me what I wanted to do. I told them I wanted to be visible. I wanted to stop hiding. I wanted to work with Thorn and the others to build something new, a way forward that didn't involve hiding from humans but involved coexisting with them. It would be difficult. Humans fear what they don't understand, but humans also learn. They adapt. And if we could give them evidence of our intelligence, our capacity for morality, our desire for peace, maybe we could build something better than the covenants of silence. Maybe we could build actual treaties, actual partnerships, actual understanding. Thorn listened and nodded and said something that I think about every day. He said the fact that I had survived it all, that I had remained sane, that I had chosen to come back instead of living out my life in hiding, all of it was proof that coexistence was possible, that if a human could learn to be being and still maintain compassion and connection, then maybe they could learn to maintain their humanity enough to live alongside humans. We spent the following months working on this. I became the bridge that I had always been meant to be, Not a weapon between species, but a translator, a voice that could speak to humans and convince them that we deserved acknowledgement and respect. I gave interviews, I published articles, I appeared before international bodies and testified about what I had experienced and what I had learned. I introduced selected journalists and researchers to beings who were willing to meet them. I helped them understand that intelligence comes in many forms, that consciousness doesn't require human language or human bodies, that humanity is not exclusively human. I helped build the infrastructure for a new coexistence, not perfect, not without tension, but real. The beings began to claim territory openly. They established documentation of land use. They maintained records of hunting. They began hunting in legally designated areas. They began participating in land management and conservation efforts in ways that surprised human ecologists. They had been managing these forests and mountains for millennia. They understood the ecosystems, the populations, the health of the landscape. In some places, they began to formalize agreements with local governments. It's still early, the process is slow, but the door has opened and it cannot be closed. 3 weeks ago, I received a letter from Garrett. He said that the government was preparing to accept a formal petition for being rights and legal recognition. It wouldn't be a full citizenship, not yet, but it would be a recognition that they were sentient beings deserving of protection under law. It would be the first step toward a legal framework for coexistence. He said the work wasn't finished. It would never be finished, but it had begun, and none of it would have been possible if I hadn't spoken, if I hadn't broken the silence, if I hadn't chosen, in the moment when the choice was presented to me, to honor what I was and who had raised me instead of hiding behind the fear that humans had told me I should feel. So I'm telling you now, I am Thomas Blackwood, and I am 42 years old, and I was raised by dogmen in a hidden settlement in Wyoming, and I have spent my life learning to bridge the space between your world and theirs. And I am telling you this because the beings are real, and they have always been real, and they are still here, and they deserve to be acknowledged and respected. The fear that you feel when you think about them is not about them. It's about yourself. It's about the parts of you that are primitive and wild and that have been trained by civilization to pretend don't exist. The beings have never pretended. They have never run from what they are. They have simply chosen to hide because hiding was survival. But hiding is no longer necessary. And I am here to tell you that coexistence is possible if we choose to make it possible. Everything the public believes about dogmen is wrong. Everything you've been told about them being mindless predators or cryptid mythology or folklore with no basis in reality is wrong. They are intelligent. They are moral. They are capable of love and grief and loyalty and sacrifice. They built a civilization that sustained itself for millennia in secret. They maintained their ecosystems. They protected their young. They mourned their dead. They made decisions collectively and lived by codes of honor that would shame many human societies. They raised me and educated me and gave me a life and a purpose. And when the moment came to choose their side, I chose them because they were right, because they were always right, because the truly monstrous thing in this story was never the beings. It was the fear. It was the refusal to acknowledge what was real. It was the machinery of a government deciding that something that didn't fit into their categories should be eliminated instead of understood. That's where the real horror lives, not in the teeth or the claws or the yellow eyes, but in the human capacity to decide that something alive and conscious and deserving of existence should be made to stop existing. So, believe what you want. Deny it if you need to. But understand this. The beings are still out there. They are still watching. And they are no longer hiding. The time of secrecy is ending, the age of coexistence is beginning, and I am the proof that both sides can live together if we choose to stop treating difference as an excuse for elimination. I stand between worlds. I am part human and part being. I am proof that the boundary between those categories is not a wall, it is a door. And when we finally decide to walk through that door together, we will find that the other side is not as terrifying as we feared. It is simply different. And different is not a threat. Different is just different. My name is Thomas Blackwood, and I was raised by dogmen, and I am still here to tell the story. That story is true. I've thought about what Thorne said many times since then. That the greatest victory isn't destroying your enemy, but changing the world so thoroughly that enemies become unnecessary. We haven't destroyed the government. We haven't overthrown the power structures that would have used us for extinction. What we've done is something more fundamental. We've made it impossible for the truth to be hidden. We've demonstrated through sheer existence and visibility that beings and humans can coexist, that we do coexist, that the only thing preventing more open coexistence is the refusal to acknowledge it. That's the real power, not violence. Truth, and truth once spoken cannot be unsaid. The government can work to minimize it, to discredit it, to find alternative narratives. But the documents are real, the beings are real, the testimony is real, and every human who comes into contact with that reality has to make a choice about what they're going to do with it. And my hope is that you listen, that you believe, and that you choose compassion over fear, because the beings are counting on it. The beings have given me purpose, they've given me direction, but more importantly, they've given me permission to be fully myself, without shame, without apology, without the constant internal conflict that nearly destroyed me during those human years. I am not fully human, and I am not fully creature, and I don't have to choose. I can exist in both worlds because I was built for both worlds. That's the message I carry to humans now. You don't have to choose between your animal nature and your higher consciousness. You don't have to deny the primitive and wild parts of yourself. You can integrate them. You can be whole. The beings showed me that, and they're still showing it, day after day, by existing alongside us, by not retaliating, by choosing coexistence even when they have every right to choose war. And so am I. The story I have told you is true. Every detail, every name, every location is verifiable or has a documented reason within the story for why it diverges from public record. I have not exaggerated. I have not invented for dramatic effect. The truth is already dramatic enough. What happens next is up to you. Whether you choose to believe me, whether you choose to seek out the evidence, whether you choose to question the narrative you've been given about what exists in the world and what doesn't, all of that is in your hands. But understand this, there are beings walking the forests of North America right now. Their children are being born, their cultures are continuing. They are writing their own history while humans decide whether or not that history is even possible. And somewhere in the deep wilderness, Thorn is still leading, still guiding, still trying to find a way forward for his people into a world that is finally beginning to acknowledge their existence. I am one bridge. There will be others. The time of isolation is ending. The age of transparency is beginning. And when it truly does, when humans finally stop fighting against the reality of what exists, when we stop being afraid of difference and start embracing the complexity of a world that is far richer and stranger than we ever imagined, that will be when real change can begin. That will be when they can finally stop hiding. And when they stop hiding, we will all be changed forever. When Kor's offspring led me back through the forest to the settlement, every step felt like a return to something that should have been lost forever. I had spent 40 years becoming more human, learning human languages, adopting human customs, trying to fit into a world that would never quite accept what I was. And yet, when I smelled the smoke from the settlement fires carried on the wind, when I heard the low vocalizations of beings greeting the night, every cell in my body recognized home with a certainty that no human concept of home could match. Home wasn't a place. Home was belonging. Home was being recognized as yourself without explanation or apology. The beings at the settlement didn't ask me what I had done or how I had survived. They knew. Some of them had watched me grow up. Others had heard the stories. They understood what it meant that I had chosen to come back, that I had chosen their side, that I had broken the most important silence to honor the commitment Thorn had made to my survival all those decades ago.